Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about federalism. Now, this breaks down pretty simply. It is the separation between state and federal government, and it's laid out pretty clearly in the 1st, 4th, 6th articles of the Constitution, as well as the 10th Amendment. We're going to break down the articles real quick. Article 1 sets up the legislative branch. That comes with the power to print money, to make laws, declare war, control interstate commerce. There's a lot more in there, but we're going to stick to a few basics just for this lesson, because later on we're actually going to have a whole class just over the legislative branch. So Section 1, Clause 8, this is the Commerce Clause. It offers the ability to the legislative branch to regulate commerce between foreign nations, regulate commerce amongst all the states, and between Native American tribes, although that last one is a little less important now than it was whenever the Constitution was written. And this first came to a head with Gibson v. Ogden in 1824. Aaron Ogden held a license under the monopoly to operate steamboats between New York and New Jersey. Thomas Gibbons had another steamboat company, also offered a monopoly. The difference being is one held a federal license, the other one held a state license. Because of this, once it finally goes to the Supreme Court, they found that because of the Commerce Clause and because they have the ability to regulate interstate commerce, that Gibbons ended up being the one that controlled the monopoly, not Aaron Ogden, although in the first suit it went through the state court and Ogden actually won. Okay, so Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 brings us to the necessary and proper clause. To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or office thereof. So, the necessary and proper clause essentially allows the federal government through the legislative branch to do whatever they deem necessary to fulfill their other roles. One of the cases that was big on this is McCulloch v. Maryland in 1816. This was whenever the federal government rechartered the national bank, forming the second national bank of the United States. Not all the states were on board with this because it started taking money away from state-run banks. And in the state of Maryland, we have a situation where the teller decides that he was not going to pay those taxes. What happens next is it goes to a lawsuit. Once the lawsuit goes through to the federal government, finally up to the Supreme Court, they found in favor of the Second National Bank. James W. McCulloch wins that case against the state of Maryland, and they make two rulings. First off, the Supreme Court rules that the legislative branch in the United States federal government absolutely have the ability to have a bank. It's a way for them to distribute money, which is one of their powers, so they have that right. They also ruled that states cannot sue the federal government, and the reason is that the power to tax is the power to destroy. So when someone says that they're being taxed out of business, they mean it. It's the exact reason that we're not allowed to tax the federal government. That brings us all the way into Article 4. Article 4 starts off, we've got the full faith and credit clause. Full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. Clause requiring each state to recognize and honor the laws, public records, and judicial decisions of every other state. Now, these we can see with marriage. Starting off with Loving v. Virginia in 1967, when Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter Loving went to Washington, D.C. to get married in 1958. When they returned back to Virginia, they found something interesting, that not only was the state of Virginia not going to recognize their marriage, but they were both jailed for it. Eventually, that would be overturned by the Supreme Court in 1967. Interracial marriage would become legal, and that marriage license would continue across state lines. Later on, we would have the same thing happen for gay marriage in Arbuckle v. Hodges, and in the same way that it was overturned with Loving v. Virginia, the Supreme Court would find that same-sex marriage had to be recognized in all 50 states. Now, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 1, that's the Privileges and Immunity Clause. Citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens of several states, essentially saying that each state has to treat every United States citizen, everyone that lives in that state, the same, that you can't be treated different whenever you cross state lines. Article 4, Section 2, Clause 2 is the Extraditions Clause. If you're not sure what that is, it basically just means if you commit a crime in one state and flee to another, that you can be sent back to the state where you committed the crime so that you can be charged. Now, We also have extradition agreements with some other countries, although that gets a little more into detail. Not all countries do it, though, which is why sometimes if someone commits a major crime here or they do something like whistleblowing, they'll end up staying in China or Russia or one of these other countries so that they can't be tried here in the United States. Section 3 also has the admissions of new states and properties. A lot of people think, for example, that you can just leave the United States. That's not the case. To bring in new properties or to have any kind of change to the United States, it takes an act of Congress as well as a vote in the area where the change is going to be made. Now, Section 3, Clause 2, Congress shall have powers to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territories or other properties belonging to the United States, and nothing in the Constitution shall be construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or any particular state. Now, this clause gives Congress authority over the federal properties and territories. It allows Congress to manage and regulate lands and properties owned by the United States, so that's national parks, military installations, things like that. We have the Guaranteers Clause in Section 4. The United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government. This does not mean Republican as in the Republican Party, but that it will have an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch. And every state in the United States, with the exception of Nebraska, has the exact same layout as the federal government. Nebraska being different because they have a unitary legislature. So instead of having a House and a Senate, they just have the Congress. That's going to bring us all the way to Article 6, where we're going to talk about the Supremacy Clause. Now, this one's pretty simple, so we're not going to get all the way down into it. The Supremacy Clause basically states that whenever there is some type of conflict between the federal and the state government, that federal law is going to win every time. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule, such as marijuana programs throughout the states. It's still federally legal, but so many states have pushed against it that the federal government has finally started to leave that alone. The 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states and respectfully to the people. Now, interestingly enough, this one has come up. The federal government tries to force states to enact regulations for disposing of low-level radioactive waste in a case called New York versus the United States. In this case, the Supreme Court found 6-3 that the states cannot be forced by the federal government to do things like that because the federal government has no right to do those things. So there are some times the federal government may try and get states to do something, but they won't be able to. So we're going to come from that point, we're going to start breaking it down into the different types of federalism. For the majority of the United States, we have operated under something called dual federalism. Now, dual federalism is very, very cut and dry. The powers of the state and the federal government do not mix, and they are very clearly defined. And we operated under dual federalism until the New Deal. So this comes in between 1933 and 1938 under Franklin D. Roosevelt, whenever he enacts a bunch of different things trying to get us out of the Great Depression. After all of that had been done, we end up in what we're in now, something called cooperative federalism. Now, in cooperative federalism, the federal government's going to start playing a much bigger role in the way that states operate. And one of the ways they do that is through giving grants and aid. They do this through two different types of grants. Categorical grants, those make up 90% of all grants, and they are very specific in what money can be used for. They would say, hey, here's $1 billion. You can use it to fix underfunded elementary schools in your state, and that's it. Okay, that's what Congress uses most of the time. Block grants, that's the other one. They have some limitations. They're way more flexible. So if you got that same $1 billion from the federal government, they could look at your state and say, hey, use this towards education. Now, how you use that, whether you fix schools or roads in front of schools or pay teachers more, all of that comes down to what the state decides to do with that money. Obviously, states like these more than they do categorical grants. There is one other way that they make states do things, and that is mandates. And mandates don't always come with money. That's why whenever they passed the Americans with Disabilities Act back in 1990, even though it did a good thing, it made all government buildings handicap accessible, it didn't come with funding. So the states had to eat that bill themselves, which became a problem. And mandates, along with grants, have been used to force states to do things that they didn't want to do otherwise. For example, the 1984 national minimum drinking age. This is when, under Ronald Reagan, they decided they were going to change the drinking age from 18 to 21. Now, the way that they did this is they came to the states and they said, hey, if you want any federal road funding for your state, you are going to change your drinking age to 21. And a few years later, pretty much every state was on board with that. Now, This is not to be confused with another thing that passed more recently in 2019, the Tobacco 21 Act. That actually passed through a spending bill. And the way that they decided to do that was putting it in there that they had control over tobacco, who could buy it, where it could be sold, all those kind of things through the Commerce Clause. And their justification was because tobacco is shipped across state lines, we have the ability to control who can buy it and how old they need to be to buy it. Face value, this is not a bad thing. Most people know that smoking is bad for you, and we really don't fight against not being able to do it until you're 21. However, the fact that they used the Commerce Clause to do it, stating that because it goes across state lines, they can control who buys it, how old they need to be to buy it. Everything in the United States gets shipped across state lines. So while this is a good thing, it also sets a precedent that can be dangerous if in the future Congress decides that they're going to misuse it in some way. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to the way that federalism works. The main advantage to how federalism works is that there's no overlap in policy. What one state needs won't affect another state. And power starts to become much, much easier to change the closer you get to home. And states, through this, maintain the overwhelming majority of control in their states. Now, the disadvantage to this, when a policy needs to be changed on national level, they're limited in their ability to make those changes. Now, two places where the states run the show: education and medical. So when those need to be changed across state lines, it's really hard for the federal government to step in. So if you go back to COVID and we look at the different changes that were going on throughout the United States, a lot of people might want to blame the presidents for that, Biden at the beginning, Biden or Donald Trump on the COVID response. But the fact is the executive branch does not have the authority to tell states what to do. That's why the response was so different in every single state. Similarly, education. Whenever the Department of Education started to become defunded, a lot of people thought that that was going to be good because they're not helping the schools anyways. But the truth of the matter is they didn't set curriculum. States set curriculum, states buy textbooks, states take care of all of that. The Department of Education did not oversee that part of education. The Department of Education oversaw funding and disability services and things like that, but they didn't oversee the actual education going on in each state, which is why out of our 50 states, they're all ranked differently. Now, currently we're in Texas. We're ranked actually right now 25 out of 50. So we're right center in the middle. Okay, and some states ranked higher, some states ranked much lower. We're in the middle, which is not a horrible place to be, but the state could definitely do better on that. And there are some ways as well that people have used this state autonomy so that they could try and overturn federal law. For example, states are in charge of voting, not the federal government. So when the federal government says they're going to, for example, shut down mail-in ballots across the country, they don't actually have the ability to do that. That's run by the states. But there was one act that was passed, the 1965 Voters' Rights Act, that did start telling the states some of the things that they weren't allowed to do when it came to voting. And this would even get challenged in Shelby County v. Holder. In Shelby County v. Holder, and this is not too many years ago, the Voters' Rights Act was challenged. The entire thing did not get thrown out, but parts of it did. This is how we have voting ID laws in some of the states, including Texas now. There have been several other conflicts between states. Texas has found themselves at the pinnacle of some of these things. Arizona found themselves at a big one with SB 1070. This was Arizona's immigration enforcement law that they tried to pass, where Arizona would be responsible for taking people and deporting them inside the state. One of the things that they were doing was stopping people based on race and checking for papers. Now, once this went to the federal government, and this is important to look at because we're looking at similar things right now, the Supreme Court actually ruled that it was illegal to stop someone just based on race or accent or job or something like that. They had to actually be committing some type of crime, even if that be a traffic infraction. But if they had reasonable cause to stop them outside of one of those things, then they could check their papers. Texas has been at the center of some of these things with Roe v. Wade back in 1973 coming out of Houston. And that was the 7-2 decision that stated that women had the right to choose. In other words, a woman could have an abortion if she wanted to. And that would go back and forth with Supreme Court. Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 1992, Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health Organization in 2022. That's when Roe v. Wade was overturned. It sent the power back to the states. There will be a time that will go back to the Supreme Court again. Texas actually has part of our law when it comes to abortions that eventually will probably make its way back to back to the Supreme Court. And the main reason for that being is that if a woman were to leave Texas, have an abortion, and return, if she's turned in, she can be charged inside the state. Now, if you remember earlier on in this quick lecture, we talked about some of the different clauses protecting people between states. That's going to violate those. And so it's going to make its way back to the Supreme Court eventually in some way. Okay, now, Texas has been pinnacle in more than one thing. We have immigration. Okay, when it comes to Texas on immigration, we fought against DACA. That was one of the big things that we went against. We passed Texas Bill SB 4, banning sanctuary cities in the state, requiring law enforcement to cooperate with federal immigration authorities. We have been on that side of that. Environmental regulations, Texas has fought against the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency. We fought against the Affordable Health Care Act in 2018 through medical expansions, stating that the states are the ones that have the rights to decide what's going to go on with our medical here. Okay, there's lots of other places that federalism has come and gone. Voter education laws, gun rights, education, for the most part. Marijuana legalization has been a big topic. COVID-19 mandates, if you go back just a few years. Commerce, energy. There's all different kinds of ways that states and the federal government are still having conflicts today. That's probably not going to change anytime soon, because while states do fall under the umbrella of the federal government, they do maintain the majority of their power, and it's unlikely that any of them are willfully going to want to give that up in the future. Thanks, guys, and I will talk to you all next week.